And we're closely tracking Hurricane Francine ahead of its predicted landfall in just a few hours.
Yeah, and if you're watching us on TV, our app, or listening to News 15 coverage on one of the 7 Delta Media radio stations across Acadiana, we are here to walk you through this storm live this afternoon.
Yeah, we are also streaming over the air on Big 102 as well, and we're joined with Storm Track 15 meteorologist Adam Olivier and Chief Meteorologist Doppler Dan Romano to give us the latest movements and path of Hurricane Francine. Did you guys get a new update in the studio?
We're going to be getting one here within the next 30 minutes, Taylor and Lauren, but we want to touch on some things that have changed since we last saw you right at the top of the hour. First and foremost, Dan, we have a tornado watch for portions of Acadiana. St. Martin Parish, really it's for the lower part of St. Martin Parish, maybe the southeastern tip here of the upper part of St. Martin Parish, Iberia and St. Mary too. So we're going to have to watch some of these storms that roll in.
It's basically areas just to the west of the Atchafalaya Basin and then eastward out towards Baton Rouge, New Orleans, down along the coast and so forth as well. So again, we see a lot of rotating thunderstorms around these tropical systems. It's very common that we see weak spinning tornadoes develop pretty quickly and dissipate pretty quickly. The thing is that some of these tornadoes can be incredibly fast moving tornadoes, almost moving roughly 50, 60, 70 miles per hour around the circulation of this system, and in this case it's Francine. So especially on the eastern side, the northern side, where those basically those storms kind of interact with the land, it creates a little bit more added friction and allows those thunderstorms to spin up. That's what the potential that we're looking at right now.
Yeah, and that tornado watch goes to 11 p.m. tonight. It may be expired a little earlier for our area, but we'll see how that all plays out. What we do have, though, is a system that is, starting to kind of show signs of maybe a little weakening, Dan. We're not seeing those bright purple cloud tops that we were seeing a little while ago, and possibly even some dry air intrusion.
Yeah, it looks like this wedge of dry air is getting wrapped all the way in. Keep in mind, all of this back here, which isn't really showing up on this map, this is incredibly dry air, and it has wrapped its way around and then kind of worked its way into the center of the system. I used this analogy over the last couple of nights. What this dry air does is really choke out the engine of this hurricane. Much like dirt gets into an engine of a car, it doesn't allow it to perform at its peak. So what happens is we see this system getting choked out by that drier air, and unfortunately we're not seeing those cloud tops blossoming as high as they potentially could, and now we're dealing with kind of weaker thunderstorms that are getting wrapped around this system, and that's an indication maybe not necessarily of a weakening trend, but what it does show is that it's not strengthening, and that's the most important thing.
Exactly, that is key. The other thing with this, not only the dry air, but wind shear. We have a lot of that here across the storm that is going to eventually cause this to kind of fall apart once it does make its way on shore later on. We have Hurricane Francine now. Again, we're going to be getting updates here every single hour as we get closer to landfall, but winds of 90 miles per hour. Dan, all morning long this pressure has stayed at 976.
Yeah, and it has not changed one bit, but the one thing that has changed, and it's actually a good sign, is the movement. It has increased its forward momentum, now moving at 16 miles per hour. So two things we could take away with that. One, it's moving quicker and it will be on our heels, or it will be barreling down on us sooner rather than later, but also at the same time, because the forward momentum will continue to increase, it's going to pick up some acceleration. That means it's going to get out of here that much quicker as well. So, this is not going to be a 24-hour event. By tonight, much of the activity associated with this system should be up and out of our area.
And that is a very good thing. We've been watching that increase all morning long. When I came on at 5 o'clock this morning, it was at 10 miles an hour. We're now up to 16, and that is fantastic. In fact, it's running a little faster than models have been anticipating. And, landfall may happen closer to 3, 4 p.m. rather than that 5 to 7 time frame. So let's hope, fingers crossed, that's the case. Category 1, you'll notice, Dan, all these little squiggles down to the south of where the storm center is located according to the Hurricane Center. Been monitoring those wobbles all day, and they've been so key to the impacts that we will see here in Acadiana. Does this go more to the east? Does this go more to the west? Hurricane Center believes this is going more on the western side of that earlier guidance, really focusing in on Morgan City as that target for landfall.
So unfortunately, the other thing that we're looking at is just the vast size of the eye of this storm, because remember, the eye itself isn't the thing that is threatening. It's the eye wall. It's where all the strongest winds and the heaviest rains are confined to. And with an eye wall that's roughly 50, 60 miles wide, I mean, that's basically one side of the eye wall in Lafayette, the other side of the eye wall in Baton Rouge. That's not the case. That's not what we're expecting. But I'm using that as an analogy, comparatively speaking, of the geography that we're looking at as this storm moves onshore. So, we could be looking at, hurricane force winds developing in portions of St. Mary, Iberia, even upper St. Martin parishes on the eastern side of it. But we're also dealing with hurricane force winds 60, 70 miles to the east of that on the eastern side of the eye wall. So again, the storm itself is not really all that big, maybe about 300 miles wide, but the eye wall itself is gigantic, comparatively speaking, 50, 60 miles. So, this is one of the things that we're looking at when it comes to this storm. It's not necessarily the eye, but it's the eye wall, because that's where the most dangerous conditions exist with a storm like this.
Yeah, and two other key things I want to show you about this forecast track that is taking this into St. Mary Parish. The Hurricane Center has this at 7 p.m. tonight making landfall, but as we were just discussing, it could be a little earlier than that, maybe closer to 3, 4 p.m. So that's one trend we're going to watch. But Dan, look at this. Let's say 7 p.m. tonight for landfall. 12 hours later, it's all the way in central Mississippi.
Yeah.
This thing is really going to get picked up and move fast.
Yeah, by the time it moves into the area, it'll probably be moving at about 16 to 18 miles per hour. By the time it moves out of the area, it could be moving at about 20 to 23 miles per hour. Furthermore, it might be a bit of semantics, but it does look like they pushed the line back maybe about 10, 15 miles from the coast. So a 7 o'clock, not so much 7 o'clock landfall, but about 15, 20 miles inland at 7 o'clock. So maybe that pushes it maybe at about 5:30, 6 o'clock landfall, perhaps what we're looking at as we head into this evening.
And I do want to show, too, as you can see spinning where that little signal is for the Category 1, there does appear that with the latest update that happened at 1 o'clock, there was a northerly turn.
There was, yes.
So that is a key there, that with that northerly motion, that puts it right in line with this Hurricane Center cone, and not so much with those models that were taking it off towards the east. But here's a good representation of that wind field that Dan was describing. We're already seeing, this is currently those tropical storm force winds now along the coast in Vermilion, Iberia, St. Mary, and Lower St. Martin parishes. But Dan, look at the size of the hurricane force winds, and then watch what happens as we get towards landfall. They almost expand a little bit.
Yeah. So we're looking at basically the eye itself expanding, well, more or less, yeah, kind of the eye expanding as it moves onshore. So, there's going to be a lot of components associated with this storm, including friction that will kind of weaken this storm pretty quickly, but it's also going to throw these winds pretty erratically across the area as well.
Mm-hmm. And we're also looking that these tropical storm force winds are extending all the way to Lafayette, Acadia parishes. They actually get a little bit bigger as the storm moves up, at least even on the western side. Look at the eastern side, though, how far they extend off all the way into Mississippi with those tropical storm force winds. This is at 10 p.m. tonight.
But fortunately, the good news is by 10 o'clock, now we're getting rid of this system pretty quickly from west to east as this system lifts up to the north. So that drier air really eating away at this system on the western side, pushing it farther up to the north and to the east quickly. And that means by later on tonight, this system is going to be a thing of the past, which is going to be great news for a lot of folks that unfortunately are going to be under the gun for the next several hours.
Yeah, and so when we kind of look at the time frame of these tropical storm force winds, say for St. Landry Parish, Lafayette Parish, Vermilion Parish, we're really going to see a time frame here starting around 3 p.m. going through about 7 o'clock for those strongest winds. Places off to the east, though, they'll start sooner and they'll last longer, possibly through around midnight before the system finally does move off and away.
Look at the camera shaking, rattling, and rolling. This is New Iberia, Queen City of the Teche camera. This is looking down southward Admiral Doyle Drive, parallel to Highway 90. So it's looking in the distance towards Jeanerette, Franklin, and eventually Morgan City and so forth.
Yeah, and that's NISH, New Iberia Senior High, right down there. But also, Dan, look at these clouds, how fast they're moving.
Yep.
And notice the direction. They're coming across the camera, across Ambassador or Admiral Doyle Drive there. And what that tells you, there's a northerly component to these winds, and that is so significant for our area. Take a look at some of the winds that we have out there. Morgan City up to 33 with the gusts sustained at 24. So those winds are creeping up. New Iberia even with a 30-mile-an-hour wind gusts.
So this is the good news is for storm surge components, or the storm surge concerns, I should say, with these northerly winds developing as the eye of the system continues to track up to the north and to the east, we are going to see the wraparound winds developing, and the north winds are going to push that water from what was built up along the coast back out to the Gulf of Mexico. So, you know, we talked about how the storm surge concerns would be early on with this system, especially in Vermilion Bay and areas out to the west. Now we're starting to see a northerly wind slowly but surely develop. The stronger and this northerly wind develops and the more northerly it becomes, well, that's going to push the Gulf water back out away from the shoreline.
Yeah, and that is so key for so many areas, especially Vermilion Parish, Iberia Parish. We're not going to see those extremely significant water rises, though we still could see up to about 4 feet of water rise there. Let's take a look at some of those gusts here. Now, again, these are wind gusts, not sustained winds. That's the big real push of air you get for a second, and then things kind of calm down. But we could see those tropical storm force wind gusts extend all the way to Lafayette through 4 p.m. here. Morgan City at 4 p.m. up to 50 or above with those gusts. Now, the eye still hasn't come on shore yet.
That's the key, because if you look, you know, now we're talking about a almost hurricane force wind gust. This is about 6:30. I think at that point, we could be looking at the eye wall, obviously impacting Morgan City, if not even sooner than that. With an eye that's roughly 50, 60 miles wide, I mean, honestly, we could see the winds actually subsiding a bit if Morgan City finds itself inside the eye of the storm, because, again, the winds in the eye are much calmer. So, again, we would go from wind gusts upwards of 70, 80, 90 miles per hour down to a trickle once we get inside that eye.
Yeah, and a couple of other things I want to make mention of here. First, really, let's just kind of for a second discount that timing. Let's just talk about overall. You have 45-mile-an-hour wind gust in Jennings, Lafayette 50-mile-an-hour wind gust, possibly even higher. Look at Intracoastal City near 60. So this extends all across Acadiana here with those really strong wind gusts that can cause some power outages. And the other thing, Dan, that we've been mentioning, northerly winds here. But if that eye comes over Morgan City, that puts some of these stronger winds closer to New Iberia, closer to Lafayette too.
Now, I do. Sometimes we look at forecast models, and I think that it's a computer model. Personally, I have a little bit of concern about seeing gusts this high out to the west because of two things. One, the size of the storm, and two, the fact that the dry air has really weakened the western flank of this system. But nonetheless, I would say from Interstate 49 and areas to the east, that's where we could really be dealing with incredibly strong gusty winds. I wouldn't be surprised if we see an occasional gust out to the west, but my biggest fear is areas out to the east, including the more populated areas along the Interstate 49 corridor and the Highway 90 corridor, obviously, as it heads down through New Iberia and Lower St. Martin Parish.
And there you can see as we get to 9 o'clock. Now, again, the timing of this likely a little earlier here, but we're talking about 80-mile-an-hour wind gust in Morgan City, even behind the circulation. At this point, the circulation's north of Morgan City. So it's not just as the storm comes on shore, it's going to be as the storm leaves the area too. And then finally going on later on tonight, those winds will start to come down. Now on satellite and radar, we are seeing this system here approaching Louisiana. And Dan, there has clearly been more of a northerly component recently with this eye. It's not really headed towards the east as much. What's going to be interesting to see within the next hour or two, if this gets north of the southern part of Terrebonne Parish, we know it's not going there, and those high-resolution models are not going to be correct.
Yeah, so two things also that we're looking at as well. Right now, as this eye wall is approaching, keep in mind, we're dealing with a counterclockwise flow around this eye. This is when all of that water is getting piled up in a Vermilion Bay. So if you are along the coast, Pecan Island, Intercoastal City. This is, why we talk about how dangerous things could be at the moment, because this is when that storm surge is really going to build, and it is building rapidly in Vermilion Bay. And again, this eye itself is going to continue to push that water forward, and it's going to get ushered even more so at the eye of the storm. 24 hours ago, like you mentioned, I thought that it was looking more like Terrebonne Parish, and it looks like I'm going to eat crow a little bit, because this northerly bobble is pushing it more towards St. Mary Parish. So unfortunately, we talked about Morgan City being under the gun of the eye, but like I mentioned before, it's not just the eye, it's the eye wall. And even the western side of this eye wall pushes it up into this area. We're talking about areas like potentially Franklin, maybe Jeanerette, areas of, even upper northern portions of St. Mary Parish that could be under the gun with the western flank of this eye wall. And that eye wall is where the strongest winds of this hurricane persist. Now, granted, it's the western side of the eye wall. So the western side of the eye wall, the winds aren't as strong as the eastern side of the eye wall. But with a hurricane that has 90-mile-per-hour sustained winds, a slight weakening trend, perhaps maybe dropping it down to 80, 85-mile-per-hour winds, we could easily see winds sustained anywhere between 60 to 70 to 75 miles per hour on the western edge of this eye wall as it slides up to the north and to the east.
Well, and in fact, this band that you see here that's starting to come into coastal Vermilion Parish, this band was the original, at least part of it, was the original eye wall on the western side. It's now kind of shifted out, almost like we're going through an eye wall replacement cycle where you get two eye walls that develop and then that inner one takes over trying to reform. That's actually pushing into Vermilion Parish, and it's coming up, actually getting closer to Lafayette Parish too. The other thing, Dan, is because of the approaching trough that's coming in from the west, you're getting a squeeze play and convergence, that's building up some of that convection, those thunderstorms on the western and northern side.
And we're seeing that wrap around on the southern side as well.
Right, so we are getting even some stronger winds, as Dan was mentioning, on that western eye wall, which typically you would see a dramatic drop off from winds from one side of the eye to the other. This one may have more consistent winds of 80, 90 miles an hour, even on the western side, just like on the eastern side, but lots of heavy rain with that.
And the thing is, the timing with this system, I mean, we're talking about, we measured it out not too long ago, it was about 40 miles off the coast. With a system that's moving 16 miles per hour, it is...
150.
150, okay, I'm too short to see the clock. So 150, we're looking at 3 hours. Within 3 hours, we are going to be under the gun. So, 150, 250, 350, by 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, in that time frame, things are going to get really gnarly across portions of St. Mary Parish. So, this is kind of when when folks are going to be really need to be hunkering down.
And this is our water vapor satellite, and we're showing you this because this represents where there's moisture in the atmosphere and where the atmosphere is bone dry. And by Dan, out into Texas and Mexico, it is completely bone dry. That's what that orangey yellow coloration indicates. That dry air, we've been watching it all morning creep down along the Texas coast, past Brownsville into Tampico, Mexico. That has been sucked into the system, and that's that little dry tongue Dan was talking about earlier on. You'll notice a few hours ago, Dan, we had all these yellow colors here that were indicating massive amounts of moisture in the atmosphere surrounding Francine. They're gone.
Yeah.
This storm is not strengthening at the present time.
And this dryer has been our saving grace for the last couple of days because, again, there were ample opportunities during the overnight hours, last night, but especially the night before, where conditions, aside from the dry air that was in the atmosphere, basically were pristine and should have allowed for this storm to unfortunately undergo what we fear rapid intensification. But if it wasn't for this dry air, that would have occurred. And fortunately, things kind of remain status quo for, one of the more active time frames that we usually see hurricanes really intensify.
And even last night when I woke up this morning, this thing was so well formed. And then this morning the drier air got caught into it. It coughed it out and created those two blobs again that we saw yesterday. There was one to the north and then Francine itself. And it never really recovered from that.
Yeah, and frankly, last night, we went off the air at about 10:30. We had an update that came out from the National Hurricane Center at about 10 o'clock. said winds, maximum sustained winds is 75 miles per hour, which was kind of similar to what we saw at 7 o'clock, but the pressure continued to drop. And then we had a hurricane reconnaissance flight. We got the data from that come out at 10:30. Then the speed or the maximum sustained winds with the hurricane jumped from 75 to 85 miles per hour. An hour after that, we saw all of this thunderstorm activity blossom. We call it convection. We saw all this convection build near the center of the storm. And my biggest fear was that when I went to bed, we were going to be dealing with, a rapid intensification process, waking up to a major hurricane. But this dry air really saved us.
Yes. And that has been such a good thing for us. I do want to also point out, you can see the upper level winds screaming here. This storm did not do what we were kind of thinking about with what happened with Zeta and Ian and also Olga back in 2019, where it kind of came up with the same flow pattern as the upper levels, tapped into that, and allowed for that rapid intensification. It's going more perpendicular, a little more perpendicular to that flow, which means that shear is starting to impact it a little more.
Yeah.
And then you can see here in the mid-levels, Dan, there's this southerly component. You can see this flow of
Lifting
moisture
right up to Arkansas.
And I think that's what's tapping in. Since this is a weaker system, models were anticipating this to have a 960 millibar pressure at this point in time. It's in the 970s. It's being felt, or it's feeling that mid-level southerly flow, and that's probably what's lifting it more to the north.
Yeah,
here.
because the higher, we talked about, look, we nerd out every once in a while. We had this off-camera conversation for about a half hour yesterday looking at all the components of the system. And one of the extremely valid points that he brought up yesterday was the fact that with a weaker storm, with lower cloud tops, it's not able to kind of feel the fingers of the upper level winds from northwest or from southwest to northeast. And instead, now that it's a smaller storm, it doesn't have the cloud tops that reach that much higher up in the sky. Now it's feeling more of the effects of this southerly flow. So now we're seeing a little bit more of a jog up to the north as opposed to the northeast. So unfortunately, that's not good for us here in Lafayette and areas to the east. But look at the width of this eye. This is
it just
mammoth.
keeps expanding out. I wouldn't be surprised if this was 70, 80 miles now, because earlier when we measured it, it was right here, and that was 60. So it's kind of gotten at least 10 miles of width.
So it's not only just the eye wall itself, but it's also, like you mentioned before, these outer bands have extremely strong gusty winds and heavy rainfall associated with them. So we're seeing one that's kind of lifting up. We'll probably see conditions deteriorate here in Lafayette pretty quickly. But again, I mean, this is a massive eye wall that we're seeing here, and winds on the eastern side of the eye wall are where the winds are very strong. But now we're starting to see the northerly edge of this eye wall inch closer and closer to the coastline, and our friends in St. Mary Parish are going to be under the gun. But, again, if this eye wall keeps pushing out farther and farther to the west, it looks like this part of it is kind of eroding a bit, and I suspect that it's going to fill in as these bands kind of come in here. But still, I mean, we could be talking about now maybe, perhaps, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but the possibility of the western edge of that eye wall even pushing as far west as maybe New Iberia.
Yeah, and this is another good point to bring up here too, that when we talk about the different aspects of the storm, you have the eye wall, you have the eye, but the eye is not the same thing as the center of the storm. The center is the minimum pressure that's measured in a hurricane. That could mean that the center's back here or the center's here, all located within that eye. The eye is just the clearing. Now, if the center points back here and it's moving to the north, it doesn't matter that this is, expanding out to the east. You're still going to get that eye wall that's coming up towards you. We're just going to have to see where that center. And I think the last reconnaissance had it about right in here, and it was making that northerly motion. So that does take it up into St. Mary Parish here within the next few hours.
So the other thing that we're keeping a very close eye on, and this is something that has been talked about quite a bit with this system, is we expect some rapid weakening once this system moves ashore. As it gets closer to the coast, it's going to encounter that upper level shear that kind of shreds this system and chokes it out. So, we could be dealing with a rapid weakening as it moves onshore. Fingers crossed that does happen. But there's not a lot of time for that to occur. So, now that we're getting updates in every hour, the one thing that we're going to be keeping a very close eye on is the pressure. The winds are going to be kind of a moot point with this system being over the open waters. But if the pressure starts to increase, If those millibar numbers starts to jump up, that's really good news. And fingers crossed that happens sooner rather than later before this system moves inland.
Dan, we are approaching the top of the hour, so I want to see if that new update has come in.
Sure.
Talk about radar real fast while I do that, and I'll let you know if that update comes in. And then once we get through that, we will go back to the desk here in a second.
Yeah, and again, this is a 2-hour radar loop, Adam, if I'm not mistaken.
3 hours.
3-hour radar loop. Okay, so again, look how quickly these bands are rolling up from the south. So, this is kind of where we deal with lulls in activity, and then very quickly we start to deal with those heavy rains and gusty winds developing across the region. Furthermore, take a look at what we're seeing with the dry air really impacting the western edge of this system. If you're out in Jeff Davis Parish right now, you're probably yawning by the fact that this system has been all bark and no bite. And we're kind of seeing that up in Evangeline Parish as well. But you drive down Interstate 49 and it's a completely different scenario as you work your way through northern St. Landry Parish versus southern St. Landry Parish. And conditions continue to deteriorate. Now, that said, with the banding that we are dealing with this system, you notice that we're also dealing with lulls, complete lulls. Like Iberia Parish right now, New Iberia, although it looks pretty nasty out there, things have kind of dried out for a short period of time. But we have this band moving into Lafayette right now, so although conditions are pretty quiet, that's going to change. Take a look at the Queen City of the Tesh camera. We're rocking and rolling. That's the winds picking up. But in terms of the winds, or in terms of the rain, we're not really seeing all that much at the moment. Do we have an update with the...
Not yet. I'm assuming that they'll come down right at 2 o'clock with that. But what we're going to do here is we're going to leave you with this picture of New Iberia atop the Community First Bank building there at Admiral Doyle and Lewis Streets. We're going to go back over to Taylor and Lauren. We're going to check in with them. And then we'll come back on as soon as we get more information of the storm.
Absolutely.
But hunker down. That's the thing, because within the next hour, we're really going to start picking up those winds.
Yep.